So this is Linda Nelson again. I'm pleased to open the final session, which is Future Challenges with Core Outcome Sets. As you remember, the first session introduced the value and need for core outcome sets. In the second session, our speakers described methodologic approaches to development of core outcomes. And in the third session, stakeholders representing different perspectives and users of core outcomes discussed how they will incorporate these outcomes. So while core outcome sets hold promise to standardize our understanding of treatment outcomes, challenges remain with respect to defining optimal methods developing core outcome sets. There are also challenges in gaining agreement across stakeholder perspectives on what and how to measure, and also what are the most efficient and optimal means to implement and maintain core outcome sets. So in this final session, our speakers with experience in developing, promoting, and using core outcome sets will reflect on the challenges that need to be addressed before the full value of core outcome sets can be realized. Our first speaker is Laura Lee Johnson, who is Division Director and the Patient-Focused Development Liaison for the Office of Biostatistics at the U.S. FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Laura Lee specializes in design, logistics, implementation, and analysis of research studies, ranging from clinical outcome assessment, qualification, to trials of all sizes. She works across FDA on patient-focused drug development initiatives. Prior to working at the FDA, she spent over a decade at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, where she worked on and oversaw clinical research and research support programs. Our second speaker this session is Donna Mesner, who is President and CEO of the nonprofit Center for Medical Technology Policy, where she leads programs to promote clinical evidence development that is patient-centered, stakeholder-informed, and relevant to real-world decision-making. She leads CMTP's multi-stakeholder Green Park Collaborative and developed the collaborative's program for core outcome sets, including methods for prioritizing patient-important outcomes in core outcome sets. She was previously the Gordon Kane Fellow in Technology, Policy, and Entrepreneurship at the Chemical Heritage Foundation and a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Integration of Genetic Healthcare Technologies, and was also a longtime laboratory director and senior scientist. And our final speaker is Chris Seide-Gibbons. Dr. Seide-Gibbons is a data scientist, psychometrician, and health science research. His research focuses on development, evaluation, and implementation of tools to collect, analyze, and report patient data. He's associate professor and deputy chair at the Department of Symptom Research at the MD Anderson Cancer Center and health director for the University of Cambridge Psychometrics Center Concerto platform. So in this final session, we hope that you will find a new idea to pursue or see a vision for how we can bring out the value of core outcome sets across our healthcare environment. Laura Lee Johnson will consider future needs for core outcome sets in regulatory settings that support efficiencies in clinical trials and beyond. Donna Mesner will share thoughts on policies for enhanced adoption, management, and impact of core outcome sets. And finally, Chris Gibbons will discuss approaches to developing more precise and reliable tools. And with that, I turn it over to Laura Lee.
Hello, and thank you for having me today. I want to talk to you, as was mentioned, about the future challenges with core outcome sets. This is our standard FDA disclaimer that these are really my views as we're moving forward through these. So an important part to think about with core outcome sets is we need to think about, are they concepts or are they specific measures? And what I'm going to posit to you is that, in fact, they are both. So you've got to think about that bigger picture, like what is it that you want to measure, right? We have to also know exactly how we are going to measure it. So if you have a concept, we then need to move into how precisely do we measure it? And that's part of what we need to think about when it comes to research. So we have to agree on the concepts, and that's one reason that FDA has moved forward, thinking that we really need very specific tools listed in our core outcome set. And as we move through and as we think about this, you have concepts, then you have to say from these concepts, what are the very specific measures that are going to be used to gather those concepts and the tools that are there. And that's how we actually gain the efficiencies. So what efficiencies do we need? We need to think about going across trials and across studies, and dare we say even healthcare delivery systems too. Because that same tool in care, in studies, and in trials allows this type of efficiency where we have training. So I've sat watching nurse coordinators before trying to say, okay, I've got to collect blood pressure using 4 or 5 different sets of operating procedures and a bunch of different case report forms. Can we hone it down? And the same thing happens when we're looking at clinical outcome assessments. If everybody is trained in the same way and the same tool is used in the same way in all of the different studies, then that training is centralized. People are more likely to do it the way that you are hoping that they're going to do it. And then the data quality improves. And especially in situations where we're trying to use real world data and bring that into trials, or you're trying to pool data across a variety of different trials, this becomes more and more important. So this also requires planning, but it allows us to speed trials to execution because everybody knows, all right, this is the indication we want to look at. These are the things we want to measure. This is exactly how we're going to measure it. The case report forms are ready. People understand the data standards and how to set up the databases for it. They've had that training. We have analysis plans, hopefully agree to estimates and endpoints that we're going to be using, and we move forward. And with that, folks that are doing research are going to save on money and on development time. But this also then feeds products and decisions about healthcare to patients and others. So when you have this same tool in care, in studies, and trials, it also lets us think about what we'll call non-inferiority trials, because this potential when you have multiple products in a space and you want to say, maybe it's another option. It's not that it's necessarily better, but most importantly, it's not worse. And so these are things that we look at as non-inferiority to make sure, and we have to build a margin, and that margin is built on a lot of mathematics. And so it's very hard when the endpoints and the way that they've been measured has changed over time for us to be able to actually justify what the margin should be and create one at all. So another thing that helps with the core outcome sets is it speeds our ability to work on meta-analyses. And so this way we can do a lot of better comparisons. Instead of trying to say, here are all the different ways and all the different outcomes that have been measured, that core outcome set gives you some similarity. It gives you that bridge across research programs. It also allows for comparative effectiveness. And while not everybody's business is comparative effectiveness, it is important as you're looking at things to be able to make those justifications. We hear many times from patients and from providers that these are just completely different. And even sometimes something has the same name, but actually the training, how it was executed, there are a lot of different versions of a tool that has the same name. This part of the core outcome set really nails down exactly what needs to be done and what needs to be used. This also helps with decentralized trials. Back to thinking about the training, when we have that same measurement, that same tool deployed everywhere, it means that you can get that nice tie-in across a lot of places, and it makes it easier to try to run decentralized trials. And this, as I've mentioned before, helps with the gathering of real-world evidence and its use. Because if something is used as part of clinical care and in natural history studies and also in our randomized clinical trials and other trials, this allows that joining together of information and sharing of control groups, borrowing of data, et cetera. Now, we get a lot of feedback that folks are very concerned, especially some sponsors, that they want something that is going to optimize. And they're like, thank you for your core outcome set. I need something that's specialized to what I am trying to study. And this, to me, gets this idea of bespoke or off the rack and maybe some tailoring. Now, I have one brother who is 6'4" and a sister-in-law who is under 5 foot. I understand that they need tailoring for their clothes. I've never owned truly bespoke outfits. Maybe one of my, dancing outfits when I was a little girl was one, but generally my clothes are off the rack. For most of us, we can go off the rack. And that is an important part. We know that many times there are very subtle differences that need to be picked up. But this also gets down to the fact of what is it that you are trying to achieve with these core outcome sets, and do you have the tools, do you have the concepts that are going to help have that sensitivity to get there? Because my personal plea says this is not just an add-on. And I've heard this over and over again from many different groups. I've been in clinical trials. It's something that I think is important, is to understand what is happening. And 100 items that'll only take you 30 minutes is not something that you want to hear when you are a patient. And if adding that core outcome set is going to get you to 110 items, that's not the goal of doing this in many cases. So I want us to really consider and focus on what matters now. So when we think about building something like this, we tend to focus on the present, but we need to think about the future. And, all of us, what matters in the future with new therapeutics? What are the different environments we're trying to work in? Folks have had concepts about, for example, decentralized trials for years. But what is our reality now? Where do we think reality is going to be 10 years from now? That's what we're really trying to build for. And how will changes in tool use impact that measurement and the interpretation? And I think this is a base part that we need to remember and to focus on, because it's not just simply concepts. We need to really think about, how is it going to be used? How can data be pooled or not pooled? But also, what is the interpretation? So at FDA, many times we're talking about clinical meaningfulness, but it's not just the tool itself, it's also how it's going to be analyzed. It's how you're going to derive the information from the measurements. So many times I'll have folks who are like, okay, I've got this daily diary. It's like, okay, now you've got a lot of data. What are you going to do with it? How are we going to pull this together? How are we comparing groups? And that's something that has to be thought about when you are developing these core outcome sets. So check in on that meaningfulness. Expect and plan for what I'll call a gentle evolution. At times, there's going to be some revolution. At times, we realize that 60-year-old tool, it has got to go, even though everybody has used it and trained in it throughout all of their careers. But we do need to keep things up to date. And this is part of the problem as you plan for many of these core outcome sets, is you do have to consider and think about, what is it? How is it going to continue to grow and move forward? So think about this. Think about, what do people want? What can they access? What is sustainable? And think about, are our trials going to be international? Where are they happening? Who is going to be using this? Who else is impacted? So when we hear, for example, with the digital health technologies, or DHTs, when we see these, we also have to think about, can they be used everywhere that the trial is going to happen? Can we go through and change what needs to be changed, whether it's sending solar panels or a battery backup, to make sure that it's always going to be functioning? Is it that you have an electronic patient-reported outcome diary and then you have a paper backup? As you think about core outcome sets, you have to think about the what ifs and how this work will work together. But another key point here is integrating what you know about measurement and the tools in that data analysis and trial planning. Too many times I see that folks forget to actually talk among themselves. And we've had this problem happen, and they say, this is the tool that everybody uses. And they ignore the fact that, in fact, there have been a lot of variations in that tool over time. And this now is not going to allow them to do the trial planning that they thought they were going to do. So how do you take what you've learned about the tool and actually turn it into good statistical practice as well? So engage your HEOR folks in trial planning, not just to select a clinical outcome assessment or a patient preference measure or to think about costs. Really engage them as you're trying to do adequate simulation plans and how to interpret the simulation. Something that came up in our Complex Innovative Design pilot program is we had a tool that many folks in the Duchenne's community use, and that tool, in fact, has a lot of problems with it. And so we asked about the implementation and the training and issues that had come up, which they didn't know about for many of the data sets that they were going to be borrowing information from. But luckily, they were able to get that information. And that's what allowed them to then create more adequate simulation plans, run those, and better plan their trial. And so this is the type of information that comes when you connect your clinicians, HEOR, the statisticians, and really work together. So we do this at FDA, but this has been a stumbling block that we've seen repeatedly where it's not a slight on the COA, but that there wasn't this engagement. And that engagement is what is key. So go talk to your trial planners and facilitate that. See, where did that external data come from? Are there any issues with data collection, training, evolutions that have happened over time, version control with the tool? And also remember, as I'm sure everyone listening to this, that not all 0 to 10 is the same. You can't just pull all that data together. So I do want us to focus and think about the efficiencies and to remember that numbers don't matter if they're not interpretable. And that's a key part of what we need to do today. As you're thinking about these core outcome sets, I want you to think about how you can use them to better plan the simulations, to think about data linkages, how to pool data and when not to as tools change. Can you reduce and reuse data? Is there something going on that is, you've got to think about the updating and the cost. And is it going to work? And FDA many times is not positioned to solve problems, but we know and acknowledge that there are problems. So we've got to think about the benefit being greater than the risk, but only if we are maintaining and able to continue to reduce and reuse data. But I do think that very few groups, unfortunately, have really integrated these measurement properties and these efficiencies into their trial design and thinking about their sample size calculations, the operating characteristics, for example. And why don't we do that integration? So we've raised some of these programs and issues, and we want others to do that as well, because this is something for all of our companies and all of our teams to be working with. So spare the people, the staff, the patients, and your study participants, and help us move forward so that we have better and better trials with, we hope, better and better core outcome sets. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Donna Messner from the Center for Medical Technology Policy. By now, you've heard a great deal in this symposium about core outcome sets. In this last session, we were told that this was where we could have some fun and be forward-thinking on opportunities and challenges for core outcome sets. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts which at times might seem more like wildly speculative musings on ways to expand the applicability, impact, and utility of core sets across the healthcare system. This is, in places, this is going to be sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. So, please bear that in mind as I go through. My hope will be that everyone will come away with some bits of speculative spaghetti that are really worth thinking about and maybe continuing to talk about. So in my view, when developed with input from patients and key stakeholders, core outcome sets can improve the coherence and relevance of future bodies of evidence, thus improving regulatory coverage, reimbursement, and care decision-making. To make this happen, core outcome sets have to be widely available and widely adopted. And I would argue that this means they have to be designed and scoped for relevance. And that means, among other things, inclusive of decision makers in the process, maintained and updated for continued relevance, adequately supported financially, and supported with policy levers to help promote their use. I'll hit on all of these themes as I go through, but I want to begin by asking if we're thinking big enough about the role of core outcomes in the health system. Can we broaden our view of core outcomes to include not only conventional clinical studies, but also platform trials where the same protocol will be used across many studies? I think core outcomes exercises are tailor-made for this purpose and should guide the design of every platform trial. And also, same could be said or similar for registries. But also, what about health technology assessment and value assessment models, outcomes-based contracting agreements between payers and manufacturers, managed entry schemes or coverage with evidence development protocols, where new products are introduced in a limited or gradual fashion in selected populations while additional clinical evidence accumulates? There are obviously some challenges here. Would this mean a separate core set would have to be developed for each one of these applications? The fact is, within any given condition, there may be more than one core set or standard set for different purposes, and they can look very similar. It's often not clear how they relate to each other or how they might apply to these other health system decision contexts. For example, on the surface, it seems as though core sets developed for clinical research in a specific condition might be readily repurposed for use in, say, a coverage with evidence development program, since the point of that program is getting additional clinical evidence. Would this always be true, and under what circumstances? These are questions that my group, along with others in the community, have been kind of thinking about for some time now. And there's really two separate questions. One is how core sets relate to each other, and then the other is how they can be repurposed to alternative policy decision contexts. At the risk of creating confusion, I'm going to kind of mush them together and discuss these at the same time, because I think the same possible solution might apply in terms of how to get answers to these questions and move towards a solution. So I'm going to do a little bit of a thought experiment to tease out these relationships more, to think about the types of outcomes needed for all these types of decisions, broadly speaking. I don't have time to go deep here, so there's a risk of oversimplifying, which would be, not very useful. But I chose Duchenne muscular dystrophy as a case example because of its complexity. This is a genetic disorder characterized by progressive muscle degeneration and weakness due to alterations of a muscle protein called dystrophin. It presents in early childhood and progresses through multiple stages, initially affecting muscles close to the core of the body, usually lower muscles first, and then moving outward to distal muscles as it progresses. So usually by around the age of 12, patients have already lost the ability to walk. This also affects pulmonary and cardiac muscles. So without going into more detail, it's clear that there are a range of possible outcomes that might take precedence at any given time. And you'll have to take my word for it. There's a long list of possible outcomes to choose from, with multiple options of outcome measures for a lot of the outcome concepts in play. There's no cure for this disorder. There are symptomatic treatments, but for this example, I want to just focus on disease-modifying therapies, which in this case means interventions to correct defects in the dystrophin gene. Research on disease-modifying therapies tends to focus on patients who are still ambulatory. The key outcomes in these studies are therefore often timed motor performance tests for things like walking, ability to stand from a supine position, or climb stairs. But in these studies, biomarkers are also important. These types of therapies have qualified for FDA accelerated approval, and some products have been approved on the basis of a dystrophin surrogate endpoint. In our work, the status of biomarkers is something we sometimes struggle with in developing core sets. Some biomarkers may quickly fall out of favor as better indicators of treatment benefit are developed. Others become well established and might even be used in clinical care down the road. So whether a biomarker is included in a core set really depends on how durable it might be, because we want these core sets to be durable, as you heard from Laura Lee. It also depends, though, on the acceptability to a range of stakeholders. In this condition, many payers initially denied coverage for the products approved on biomarker endpoints because of what they saw as a lack of direct evidence of clinical benefit. This type of evidence disconnect often takes place between regulatory and payment decision makers. So a biomarker endpoint would be an unlikely choice for many of these health system applications, at least when a product is new, and especially applications where the point is to provide evidence of benefit meaningful to payers. But then there are these other endpoints related to physical function, and these could be good indicators of benefit and a policy framework to satisfy payers. But then are there any other issues to consider for these types of endpoints? One issue to consider is that a lot of these downstream applications are facilitated through the use of electronic health records. So to be relevant for some of these other contexts, a core outcome set for clinical research has to specify outcome measures that can and will be used in clinical practice. Yet, for example, one of the more common measures used in clinical trials for Duchenne is the 6-minute walk test, which frequently is not doable in clinical practice because the required length of course for the test is too long for many community practice settings. Finally, health-related quality of life is certainly a parameter that's highly relevant in multiple contexts. In this condition, other aspects of burden are also extremely important to families, including financial toxicity and family stress. These might be included in a burden of illness study and feed into a value assessment, but it's unclear whether these additional outcomes would be taken up in other applications. So overall, looking at this example, we definitely see some complexity in the cross-applicability of outcomes. Yet, if we develop core outcome sets anticipating, for example, that some measures popular in research cannot readily be used in practice, we can address some of these complexities from the outset. Another way to think about this might be to imagine the expanding health system decision context in layers. This depiction that I've put up for you might remind you of the Omeract onion, where essential outcomes are at the core and optional ones are in the layers. This is a little bit different. I'm not trying to imply that we're just adding outcomes to a core set for each layer as an option, although you may in fact choose to do that depending on your scope. But rather, the idea is that whatever scope you have established for your core outcome set, if you keep this broader picture in mind, you can identify opportunities for cross-application of outcomes across these layers. Of course, right now, our reality is that current outcome sets have been developed without conscious awareness of how they might fit into this larger picture. So as a result, our current core outcomes applications map looks something like this. Or I would argue increasingly it will in the future as more and more core outcome sets are done. Given the current trend, there are bound to be multiple types of core outcome sets for a given condition in the future. So is it possible to take our existing sort of scatter plot of core outcome sets and consider them in the context of this more comprehensive view and end up with a conceptual map of outcome sets that looks more like this. I would suggest, at least theoretically, I think this is possible. It's worth thinking about. By the way, as a sort of a nod to the Omeract onion, some folks in my office have started to call this the CMTP carnation. I kind of like the way that sounds. Maybe we can talk about that later. So how would we do this without creating a lot of disruption? I would suggest that we can work towards something like this carnation through review and update of core outcome sets. This is a process that we need to take seriously to maintain the ongoing relevance of aging core sets. And currently, there is no agreed community-wide systematic process for revisiting core outcome sets that I'm aware of. So as a community, I think this is something we should try to address together. In the process, we can incorporate considerations for promoting wider applicability of core outcome sets to work towards a more coherent map. So a quick note on why revisit core outcome sets. And we heard some of these themes from Laura Lee. Each outcome recommended in any core set has a shelf life. Accepted practices change. Innovation in therapeutics can change standards of care. Innovation in measurement science can change the perceived relevance of commonly used measures. And other changes in social or community values may take place, causing a re-examination of what are considered appropriate outcomes to measure in a given condition. So if we're going to do this, how should we go about it? How can we systematically and fairly reassess existing core outcome sets? I've got a few process suggestions, but before I go there, it's important to stress, and we heard this theme also from Laura Lee, and I agree completely, the purpose of core outcome sets is to promote stability across what gets measured in studies, to make comparisons across studies and across time. So I don't think we should be trying to revolutionize outcomes on a routine cyclic basis, although sometimes that may be appropriate. But by and large, we should be looking for evolutionary improvement. So that said, can we envision a more systematic, comprehensive process? To me, the COMET database looks like a useful place to begin. I haven't asked Paula Williamson if they would be willing to do this, but it would be useful to conduct an annual review and flag all the core sets of a certain age. I'm not sure what that would be, maybe 10 years. Give the original developers first dibs on the review, and then announce more broadly if for some reason they can't take it on. Specialized groups like Omeract could be expected to manage their own review process within, the parameters that the community has agreed are reasonable. COMET already suggests that if you want to go back and look at an older core outcome set, you assemble an expert panel. I would expect patients to be involved in that. And ideally, I would want to see both veterans of the original course set to get perspective on the original process and rationale, along with new experts for a fresh perspective. And I think it's especially important to assess who else needs to be at the table now who wasn't there before. So this means asking the question, who is intended to use it and who will be affected by its use? This also presents an opportunity to consult experts who can speak to uses of outcomes in that broader conceptual map that I discussed. In terms of process, these steps are pretty self-evident, so I'm not going to talk through the whole thing, just a couple of points. I advocate, and I advocated this in the first session of the symposium as well, vetting the outcome concepts first before going to the instruments. Look at the continued relevance, not only of individual concepts and domains, but also the completeness of the outcome concepts represented across the core set as a whole. Don't assume that you already know the concepts of greatest importance. because this assumption often leads to important gaps in clinical evidence. The instruments then offer an opportunity to consider advancements in measurement science and ways to promote connection points in that carnation that I showed you. Whatever recommendation the group ultimately produces, you need input from key decision makers that will be affected by them. You need their buy-in, otherwise it will become a barrier to adoption. So how do we pay for this? Obviously, none of this is free. This table represents my take on the current funding landscape for core outcome sets. I won't go into painful detail, but I want to make a few quick points. Life science companies sponsor a great deal of the core outcomes work currently being done, maybe especially in the US. And they allow sufficient resources to do this work well, which is something I'm really grateful for. But if you have a non-pharmacologic focus or you're working in an area that's not a high priority for large companies, this type of funding is not going to be available. Public grants for core outcomes are around, it seems to me, and this is just my perception, that they're more available in the UK and Europe than they are in the US. I'm happy to be disabused of that impression, but I'm very glad to see the FDA COA pilot program, but I think that's more about developing clinical outcome assessments than it is about core outcome sets. It's very important work. But I don't think it's designed to do what core outcome sets aim to do. And then in my experience, it's smaller foundations, often with disease-specific focus, are more likely to get involved in this work than the large big-name foundations, but they often have limited resources. So what does this mean for paying all of this? I know it's easy to call for more public support, but I do believe this work is a public good and that there's a legitimate place in the public research portfolios for it. And in the US, I think this is especially true. I'm going to call out the Patient-Centered Research Outcomes Research Institute, the CORI, because of their focus on comparative effectiveness research. We heard from Laura Lee earlier how this core outcome sets particularly benefits this type of research. And so I would think that they would have a special interest in funding this kind of work. But also, if I was going to give you a blue sky scenario, and I don't know how this would happen, but clinical research is an international endeavor, and core outcome set development is also international in scope. So my blue sky scenario might involve a public-private international fund for core outcomes development and maintenance. And then while I strongly believe that the best way to promote adoption of core sets is to assure that they're feasible, relevant, and that you have buy-in from decision makers, policy levers do help. So if grant makers were to require core outcome sets to be used in clinical research that they fund, for example, it would definitely help to raise awareness. So I've tried to argue that the benefits of core outcome sets can and should be brought to a range of applications, and that we should strive to understand how core outcome sets can relate to each other for broader applicability, perhaps using core outcome review and update process to achieve this incrementally. Either way, this review and update process really should happen. At the end of the day, to reap optimal benefits from core sets, they have to be, again, designed and scoped for relevance, inclusive of decision makers, maintained and updated for continued relevance, adequately supported financially, and promoted through policy. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Good day. Today I'd like to talk about the future of core outcome sets and describe and demonstrate some of the research that we've been conducting in this field. I'm going to begin today's talk by discussing my perspective, the work I've done with patient-reported outcomes, and where I believe they're heading in the future. I'm going to talk specifically about some of the issues that I perceive with PROs and core outcome sets, and introduce some of the tools and technologies that could be leveraged to overcome some of the future challenges and opportunities. At the end of this session, there will be questions for all of the speakers who have presented today. My background, I'm a psychometrician by training. I've developed patient-reported outcomes for a number of different disease areas. I'm also a data scientist with an interest in machine learning and health service researcher with an interest in the evaluation of complex technologies to improve health and well-being. Specifically, my research focused on the use of technology to reduce the barriers and unlock the potential of PROs in clinical practice. And that it is with this perspective that I primarily see core outcome sets as useful for clinical practice and value-based healthcare. And I perceive that the reason they are useful is because they allow us to standardize, to allow for international comparison in quality improvement initiatives. But I hope that what I talk about today will also be relevant for those with a preliminary principal interest in core outcome sets for clinical trials and drug development. When I began to think about core outcome sets, their development, and their purpose, this quote by attributed to Abraham Lincoln came to mind, where he said, "If you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 sharpening an axe." And I wonder if the development of core outcome sets has somehow fallen foul of this and not spent the time to sharpen their axe before developing these core outcome sets, and in doing so have missed out on some of the potential optimizations that could have been offered by modern technology and tools. So I'm going to talk about the need to sharpen the tools, our PROs, that are within our core outcome sets. I think that core outcome sets were developed without full appreciation of the opportunities science and technologies can offer. And as such, many modern technologies that are shown to be beneficial, and I'll introduce some of them in this talk, have not been fully leveraged within core outcome sets. And as such, the patient-reported outcome measures that we include are not optimized. When we think about the history of questionnaire assessment, we know that the first ever questionnaire assessment was conducted some 4,000 years ago as a kind of pen and parchment test to ascertain who could be a general in the Ziyad dynasty armies. Fast forward some nearly 4,000 years, and in the 1960s, we developed the first patient-reported outcome measures. Pencil and paper, this time assessments on which patients were able to circle responses on Likert scales related to standardized questions. My worry is that we are now here in the 2020s, and we have a raft of new technologies and the internet and big data and deep learning, etc. But what we are actually doing is not particularly dissimilar to the PRO assessment that we were doing in the 1960s, which itself has not evolved a great deal in the past 4,000 years. So more concretely, some of the issues with core outcome sets is that the questionnaires we use, they use raw scores, that is, scores which are added together from each of the items to create a summary total score. They're developed in such a way that it's not necessarily straightforward to compare between different sets or different measures that are representing different things on different sets. And due to their nature, we must use every single question every single time. And there are some solutions to these issues. This doesn't necessarily need to be the case. And in fact, modern psychometrics, utilizing modern software, can be used to provide precise psychometric scoring, so not having to rely on raw scores. It can be used to develop accurate crosswalking between measures and allows us to grant flexibility in the way that we administer the PROs to patients. And I'd like to focus in on this last point particularly and introduce a technology known as computerized adaptive testing. Computerized adaptive testing is essentially a computerized tool which makes a questionnaire act like a wise doctor who only asks the most relevant questions to get the information that she needs. Specifically, it is really a predictive algorithm calibrated using what we call item response theory to understand the probabilistic relationship between patients and questionnaire items. In 2016, I developed my first computerized adaptive testing for the widely popular World Health Organization quality of life measure. I was able to show that by applying this computerized adaptive testing, we can reduce the length of the WHO-QoL 100 by 2/3 and reduce the length of the WHO-QoL breath by almost a half. On adaptivequal.com, you can see this assessment for yourself, and it has been live for about 4 or 5 years now. Looking at the data collected in those past 4 or 5 years, I can see that each assessment is shortened by about 10 minutes, and this is for a single questionnaire only, compared to the original WHO-QoL 100. And if we leverage that up to the entire population in my research sample, we say just by employing this CAT algorithm, which creates assessments which are just as accurate as the original paper-based measure, we've saved some 55 days of assessment time in my research sample. Again, if you imagine that these kind of time efficiencies and savings could be saved up to an entire core outcome set, could drastically improve the efficiency and feasibility of routinely collecting this information. Our group has conducted a number of computerized adaptive tests with different measures, which are some part of different ICHOM standard sets, and we see a pretty similar pattern of about 60 to 80% reduction in length by applying these algorithms to questionnaires that are already existing. I'd now like to talk about 3 challenges and some opportunities that are brought about by these challenges, specifically the rising prevalence of multimorbidity, telemedicine, and the desire for treatment optimization. It's unfortunately true that most adults now over age 65 have a long-term condition, and most of those adults that have a single long-term condition actually have more than one. It raises questions about how the standard sets that we develop typically for individual conditions can function for people who have multiple conditions. And whilst there is no current ready answer to that, we know that psychometric theory can allow us to co-calibrate between PROs, and there are great initiatives in the US, such as Stone, doing that. It may also be feasible to create a single item bank with some common items, which are both generic and disease-specific, to allow us to measure equally between different standard sets. A very nice paper was recently published as a preprint by Caroline Tavey, and you can see the link for that there. One aspect of care provision that has become especially salient during this COVID pandemic is the provision of care from home using telemedicine. The pandemic has, at least at our institution, shown us that care from home is desirable for patients and indeed providers, and also eminently feasible. This new model of care provision, or this model of care provision that's becoming increasingly popular, can easily facilitate the collection of core outcome sets and the use of patient-reported outcomes to monitor care and improve responsiveness, and therefore improve outcomes. Because these telemedicine initiatives are driven by smart technologies, then we're able to integrate things like computational tools like computerized adaptive testing. It allows us to raise questions about whether the assessment intervals that we decided for in the original core outcome sets, and many core outcome sets of every 6 months, every 2 years, whether they still make sense. Certainly for clinical practice, a lot of times the assessment interval was decided around the feasibility of having a patient complete a questionnaire face-to-face when they make a visit. By collecting information direct from a patient's device at home, we can ask questions every day, every week, every month. And I've linked a paper here where I talk about the possibility of utilizing computerized adaptive testing to create ultra-short questionnaires that we could ask at a more a shorter interval. But the thing I think is really to be leveraged, and an opportunity that is provided as part of telehealth, is the provision of feedback, particularly to patients, but also to clinicians. Because in fact, this part of the patient-reported outcomes assessment transaction that is likely to improve the assessment experience. And we saw that in a randomized experiment where we compared PRO feedback to completing PROs without feedback using the World Health Organization quality of life measure that I mentioned before. We created feedback which both provided a graphical summary of a patient's scores and also a tailored text feedback portion, which would explain what patients could do next and had geo-relevant links, so a patient could click and receive hospital or social care depending on what was suggested by their PRO scores and based in their geographical location. What we saw in this experiment is that receiving tailored text feedback does significantly improve assessment experience and includes a likelihood of completing assessments again. But again, in my experience, I don't know that the provision or the existence of tailored or tailorable feedback for PROs has ever been a condition on which was used to make a decision to include into a core outcome set. And again, talking about assessment timing. So these problems were designed originally for administration in one-off research studies or in-person clinical visits. They often ask, how did you feel over the past 2 weeks? As I mentioned, ecological momentary assessment, this idea that we can assess more frequently and with a higher granularity of data to understand the change in outcomes as measured by PROs. Can be enhanced by the utilization of computerized adaptive testing. And finally, I'd just like to introduce a concept of treatment optimization. So currently, clinical practice based on core outcome sets may use group level evidence, a sort of standard evidence-based medicine, to say that on average, patients do better with treatment A or treatment B. But these are only treatment recommendations that are provided on average and almost by definition do not necessarily apply to every individual patient. Some patients might do less well on a treatment which is recommended by group level evidence. So our lab have been looking at the application of machine learning and data science with patient-reported outcomes data to provide individual patients of predictions of patient outcome. To be able to say that based on data from patients just like you, this is a treatment that will work the best for you and not having to rely on average scores from group level evidence. One recent study that we did using a ICHOM recommended measure for breast cancer, the BreastQ. We took almost 2,000 patients from the United States from 10 centers, and we'd made baseline and follow-up assessments from 5 baseline PROs and 9 clinical variables. And we used this data to train a series of machine learning algorithms, and you can see further details in the reference there. We found that these algorithms could then predict a woman's satisfaction with her breast, again, one of the ICHOM core outcomes, at 2 years with up to 82% accuracy. And the predictions which were made were often at odds with the evidence from kind of group-based prospective studies. There were no randomized trials in this area. And again, our group has applied these kind of techniques to different kinds of relevant outcomes and often find that we can use these machine learning algorithms to predict individual outcomes with high accuracy. We think that there is eminent applicability of these techniques to core outcome sets, but again, note that core outcome sets were never developed with this in mind, with the fact that the PROs that are included have to have like high psychometric quality to be able to provide the sufficient signal to create these excellent level of predictions. So I'm going to introduce some tools that we can use to help evolve the blunt axe that we ought to have sharpened before we started on our endeavor to create core outcome sets. And I believe that the combination of psychometrics, data science, technology, and health services research will give us all that we need to improve the accuracy, comparability, and usefulness of core outcome sets and patient-reported outcomes, and allow us to go from the Bronze Age technologies of the past into the modern era of optimized, ergonomic, and smart technologies. I believe that psychometrics can, in a sense, give us a sharper blade, can reduce the burden of our assessments to help us tailor our assessments to individuals while still retaining the important comparability that is a core feature of outcome sets, and to cross-calibrate between different outcome sets to reduce redundancy, particularly in patients who have multiple conditions. I believe that leveraging health services research can allow us to have a comfortable grip on our axe, let's say, to help us understand how we can provide useful and engaging feedback to patients and clinicians, and to understand more about how these tools are used in practice and how we can iterate them and improve, not just to create a standard set and then let it go out into the wild, but to systematically evaluate its use and iterate based on those evaluations to improve its usefulness. I believe that data science can, in a sense, elongate our handle so we get more value with every swing of our core outcome sets axe. I believe that providing individual level predictions of outcome based on core outcome sets represents the future of personalized care and allowing patients to decide on care pathways that are tailored to them using data from patients just like them. And we've demonstrated that that is feasible in early studies. So in conclusion for today's talk, is that PROs in core outcome sets are predominantly built around technologies and forms of assessment that are outdated. And there are multiple instances where we've been able to demonstrate that these modern technologies can provide tangible advantages for the assessment of PROs in the context of core outcome sets. I believe that this subtle evolution of methods can improve the use and usefulness of PROs both now and also in the future in this context. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions if there are any.